If you are not an anarchist, your political views are probably something to do with influencing what the government, sometimes called the state, does. For example, if in a political context you extol the virtues of education, then you are probably either advocating for more government schooling, or, if you think the government does a bad job of schooling, less government schooling. Either way, politics is about what the government does. If you are an anarchist, on the other hand, then your political views are about opposition to the government. Even for you, politics is still about what the government does. So, what is a government? That might seem like a silly question to some. We intuitively know what the government is. It's that organization with the president that bosses people around. However, there are many organizations with presidents that boss people around, and not all of them are considered governments. Companies, unions, clubs, etc. What is it that makes the government a government, but those organizations not governments? Possible definition of government number 1. A lawmaker. Perhaps the US government, for example, is a government and a random chess club is not, because the government creates and enforces laws. That is, they write down things which people under their jurisdiction must do or must not do, and enact consequences on those who fail to comply. However, a chess club also does this. It will require its members to follow the normal rules of chess, as well as certain house rules, touch move for example. If its members do not follow these rules, then consequences will be levied. Is a chess club a government? Surely not. So, what's the difference? If a government is defined by its role as lawmaker, the difference must be that a chess club has rules, not laws. But this just pushes the question back a step. What's the difference between a rule and a law? Perhaps the difference there is that a chess club's rules apply only to those on the chess club's premises, while the government's laws apply to everyone in the entire country. However, we usually define the boundaries of countries based on the jurisdiction of their governments. It would be circular to say that an organization is a government because its rules apply to an entire country, and the jurisdiction in which an organization's rules apply is a country because that organization is a government. It also can't simply be the size of the jurisdiction. There are already very small countries, and their governments are still governments. Perhaps, instead, the difference between rules and laws is the type of consequences that they carry. After all, the chess club will only suspend you from the chess club, perhaps even expel you from it. But the government will lock you in a cage. Being kicked out of a chess club does not violate your rights. Being locked in a cage does. Perhaps a law is a rule for which you will be punished in a severe way, a way that would normally be considered a rights violation. I, for one, am actually fairly happy with this definition of laws, as opposed to rules. But if we accept it, then laws cannot be the defining feature of a government. Why? Because there are plenty of rules that were not created by the government, the consequences for which are rights violations. The mafia, for example, may require you to pay protection money or prohibit you from selling drugs too close to where they are. If you violate these edicts, then the mafia may commit various rights violations against you. By the definition we're considering here, these rules would be considered laws. Does this mean the mafia is a government? Perhaps you would be willing to bite that bullet and say, yes, the mafia is a government, in order to protect the definition of government as the origin of laws. Fair enough, I say. But what about a man simply protecting his own property outside the jurisdiction of a government? If you and I were stranded on a desert island and I caught a fish, I may protect that fish from you by telling you that if you steal it, I shall punch you in the face. You may make the same threat to me if you catch a fish. This constitutes a rule, don't touch my fish, and the punishment for breaking it would normally be considered a rights violation, a punch in the face. Again, by our current definition, these are laws. And we are each creating and enforcing them. Are we then a government? Maybe two competing governments? Seems dubious. Perhaps you have yet another idea about what distinguishes rules and laws which I haven't addressed. I cannot possibly go through all of the possible answers. If so, try to think of a non-governmental organization or individual who creates rules to which your definition of laws applies. I suspect that you will be able to think of something. It seems that lawmaking cannot be the distinguishing feature of a government. Either we define laws in such a way as to make that circular, or we define laws in such a way that the government is not the only source of them. Possible definition of government number 2, a monopoly on violence. This definition has some initial plausibility. The government does commit a lot of violence. It commits mass murder, usually referred to as waging war. It kidnaps innocent people and puts them in cages, usually called arresting people and jailing them for victimless crimes. Many governments even execute their own citizens. The government is also funded almost entirely through violence. Every tax that the government levies is ultimately paid because the government has a well-known threat that it will send its goons to lock you up if you don't pay. That's pretty violent, I would say. However, despite this initial plausibility, monopoly on violence is too extreme of a definition. Having a monopoly on something means that you are the only one who can do it. By this definition, there are no governments. No country has eschewed violent criminals from their society entirely. Violent criminals are not part of the government, and so their existence means that so-called governments do not have monopolies on violence. Possible definition of government 3, an attempted monopoly on violence. This issue is sometimes responded to by claiming that the government need only attempt to maintain a monopoly on violence in a society. Here's a definition from Murray Rothbard. Briefly, the state is that organization which attempts to maintain a monopoly of the use of force and violence in a given territorial area. Murray and Rothbard, Anatomy of the State. Unfortunately, this definition doesn't help. Taken seriously, it would mean that the US government is not a government. The US government allows many acts of violence by non-governmental actors. Self-defense, for example. Therefore, it does not even attempt to maintain a monopoly on violence. If we attempt to salvage this by saying that because the government allows these acts of violence, they are in some sense acts of the government, then we get the opposite problem. Everything is a government. You are a government. You also attempt to stop everyone committing violence except for the people who you allow to commit violence. It's tautological. Possible definition of government 4, a monopoly on legitimized violence. Another variation on this theme is that the government is not a monopoly on violence in general, but merely a monopoly on legitimized violence. Legitimized violence being violence that society treats as acceptable. The state is the form of human community that successfully lays claim to the monopoly of legitimate physical violence within a particular territory. Max Weber, Politics as a Vocation. Again, this has some plausibility. Initially. When the government forcibly takes people's money, society says it's just taxation and it's fine. When you do it, society says it's robbery and you should be locked up. When the government locks a non-violent person in a cage, society says that is just an arrest and a jail sentence and it's fine. But when you do it, society says it's assault and kidnapping and you should be locked up for a very long time. However, again, self-defense is the pertinent counterexample here. If you shoot an attacker in self-defense, this is definitely a violent act. But not only does the government consider it legitimate, society agrees and treats it as such. Self-defense is therefore legitimized violence, and the government does not have a monopoly on it. Possible definition of government 5, a monopoly on legitimized coercion. A subtler variation of this definition is that the government does not have a monopoly on legitimized violence, but it does have a monopoly on legitimized coercion. By coercion, in this context, I mean rights violation. This is sometimes called aggression by NAP-loving libertarians, so if that's you, feel free to do the word substitution in your head. In our society, we generally believe that you have a right to your property. If I steal or break your property, I have violated your rights. This also extends to your most vital property, your body. If I damage or abduct your body, I have very clearly violated your rights. However, we believe that you lose your right to your property if you use that property to violate the rights of another. Again, this applies to your body as well. That is why self-defense is not considered coercive, even though it is violent. Self-defense is violence against the body of someone who has forfeited the right to bodily integrity by violating the rights of another. Because your attack has forfeited his right to bodily integrity, you are not violating any rights by harming him. This is how a monopoly on legitimized coercion is different from a monopoly on legitimized violence. A monopoly on legitimized violence would be the only entity in a society whose violence is ever treated as legitimate. This falls prey to the obvious self-defense counterexample as we discussed. A monopoly on legitimized coercion, however, needn't be the only entity whose violence is legitimized, but only the entity whose coercion is legitimized. Self-defense is violent but not coercive. The fact that the government does not prevent non-government actors from engaging in self-defense does not mean that it doesn't have a monopoly on coercion. One might argue that this definition is self-contradictory. The violation of rights is by definition not legitimate. If coercion cannot be legitimate, then a monopoly on legitimized coercion is like a monopoly on three-sided squares. However, all that is needed to rescue this definition from such an attack are the words would otherwise. An agency has a monopoly on legitimized coercion if it performs acts which would otherwise be treated as violations of rights, and are legitimate or legitimized only because they are performed by that agency. The remaining problem with this definition is that the government is not the only organization whose coercive violence is legitimized. It does not have a monopoly. Most societies, perhaps all, have some forms of coercion which they treat as legitimate, even when not performed by the government. Some examples might include violence against a cheating spouse, violence against someone who used a highly taboo word, violence against someone in a lower social caste, violence against someone who supported the wrong sports team, violence against someone with an abnormal but non-violent sexual predilection, violence against someone who professes belief in the wrong ideology, violence in favor of the correct ideology, theft by someone seen as sufficiently desperate, theft against someone who is seen as sufficiently wealthy, and many other possibilities. These are all types of coercive violence that in many societies, often including our own with respect to some of those, will allow to happen without reprisal to the perpetrator. That is legitimized coercion, an action which would normally be seen as coercive, but because of some legitimizing factor, is treated as legitimate. These non-governmental examples of legitimized coercion show that, like the previous proposed definitions, the definition of government as monopoly of legitimized coercion rules out the US government, and so it is probably not the definition we want to use. My favored definition of government, an agency of legitimized coercion. Since the government doesn't have a monopoly on legitimized coercion, but its coercion is treated as legitimate by society, the best definition of government really seems to be just an agency of legitimized coercion. This is also the definition used by prolific libertarian thinker David D. Friedman. A government is an agency of legitimized coercion. I define coercion, for the purposes of this definition, as the violation of what people in a particular society believe to be the rights of individuals with respect to other individuals. David D. Friedman, The Machinery of Freedom. This is not to say I necessarily agree with Friedman on exactly what this means. Friedman's elaboration on this definition may differ somewhat from mine, or not, depending on how you interpret him. But here is how I would unpack my version. An agency of legitimized coercion is different from a monopoly of legitimized coercion in that it does not require the government to be the only producer of legitimized coercion in society. What it requires is merely that coercion be legitimized on the grounds that it comes from the government. When an assault is committed, it may be justified by the attacker in a number of ways which the society will usually accept. He's in a lower social caste. He said the forbidden word. He's a sodomite, etc. But one possible justification is, attacking this man was the job assigned to me by the government. This peculiar characteristic that the government has is what defines it. If you are seen to be acting in your capacity as an agent of the government, then your coercive violence will be treated as more legitimate than it otherwise would have been. That is what it means to be an agency of legitimized coercion. It means that your coercive acts are treated as legitimate specifically because they are seen as your actions. One complication is degree. Consider an organization, association with which can legitimize coercion in some special cases, but which is mostly organized around other non-coercive things. Legitimized coercion is neither its primary function, nor its primary source of funding. I do not consider that to be an organization of legitimized coercion. any more than I consider a man who has smoked 5 cigarettes in his life to be a smoker. By contrast, the organization we normally refer to as the government is almost entirely funded by acts of coercion, such as taxes, and puts that funding largely towards acts of additional coercion, such as waging war and jailing people for victimless crimes. One rebuttal you might have is that this word would classify as governments some organizations which we don't usually see as governments. Some mafias, for an obvious example. In this case, I might really just bite that bullet. Some subcultures, and in rare cases in history, whole societies, really do treat mafia as legitimized in their coercion. In those cases, the mafia really is a small government, by this definition. However, in most societies, people do not treat the mafia when it commits coercive acts the same way they treat the government when it does so. Resist mafia coercion and our society will usually support you. Resist government coercion and our society in general will not. They may even label you a tax evader, draft dodger, or something similar and support your punishment. In most societies, mafias are not governments. In case you skipped to this section, I will give a TLDR. A government is an agency of legitimized coercion. That is, an organization whose primary function is to legitimize acts which would otherwise be seen as rights violations. There are other ways in which people can legitimize their coercive actions, but when they routinely are able to do so by getting society to see those acts as acts of a specific organization, then you should consider that organization a government.